All right, start making your way in. We got about 2 minutes before we get started. Come on in.
Yeah, come on. Woo. Okay, let's turn that down. Turn it down. There we go. Good. All right. Yeah, everybody come on in, grab a seat. This is a little bit easier than it was a few minutes ago to find a seat. I want to thank our visitors. You guys helped us set a attendance record this morning, 338, which I think is somewhere close to 40 above our last one. So thank you for that. Thank you for your attendance.
Check.
If you can turn me down just a little bit more. Okay, since we do have quite a few visitors this morning, I'm going to do a little more review than I normally would. And I know review is good because even when Darrel does review on the names of God, we're kind of like, oh, wait a minute, I can't remember. So we're talking about the covenants. This class is a covenant journey. We're talking about the covenants that God establishes with His creation, with His people, and with His nation, and finally with His church. And we've talked about some interesting ideas in this. While the Genesis account of creation doesn't actually use the word covenant, I want to remind you that if you've ever had a baby, you probably would say that you are in a covenant relationship with that child. If not, you've saved a lot of money and a lot of heartache, right? So children require that ongoing, unrelenting commitment, and that's what we sign up for. The place I want to start now, because I think this is really important that we don't lose this information, and that is that it says in the creation account that God made man in His image and in His likeness. Remember how I'm talking about these two concepts? Somebody remind me again what it means. Give me some of the key ideas of what it means to be made in the image of God. To look like, okay? Somebody else. I'm sorry? A selfie. Good. What? Same attributes. Remember we held up the dollar bill and showed the currency of the U.S. and we had a president on there, and that shows that dollar bill is backed by the full faith and credit of the government behind it. It tells us where it comes from. We also use kind of the slang idea, and that is when somebody picks up a baby and they go, oh, he's just the spitting image of so-and-so. He doesn't look just like. I mean, if you have a 40-year-old father and a newborn, they shouldn't look identical at that point, right?
When you're both bald,
there's more similarities than others.
I'll tell you that.
So the idea of being made in the image of God means that you are a son of God, that your authority comes from God, your position comes from God, and that your relationship is tied to God. And I'm going to point out again that what really the image of God is talking about is our connection, our one-on-one connection with God. Okay? The other one is somewhat just like, guess what? It's going to be tied to our neighbors. And that is the idea of being made in the likeness of God. Does somebody remember what we were talking about with the likeness of God? Yes, it has to do with taking on the mission that God gives, right? Doing the... Go back to the... Grandpa, yes. That doesn't mean you look like them. It means you what? Act like them. And so who is it that we get to act like There we go. Who is it that we get to act like to? The people around us. So being made in the image means that we are image bearers of God. It means that we are sons of God. It means that we are heirs of God. It means we are in the royal lineage of God. But being in the likeness of God means that we take care of others the way that God would have us take care of people. It means we are God's agent in that space. So loving God and our neighbors starts pretty early in the text. We talked about how that covenant then gets renewed with Noah. How basically it's a start from scratch. We talked about some of the similarities a couple weeks ago with the idea that as the waters parted, God said to Noah, go be fruitful and, which sounds an awful like what we get in Genesis. So the story is reaffirmed. The covenant is reaffirmed through Noah. And then last week we talked about Abraham and how Abraham is a change, because now Abraham, the covenant is not with an individual, the covenant is with a nation. We're moving from God just being a God with one-on-one relationships. And why do we know that that's important? Because the chapters right before Abraham tell us about all the nations that are forming, coming out of the lineage of Noah. And so God says there's all these nations. Well, I'm going to choose a nation. Abraham, I'm going to choose a nation that's going to come from you. So can I get somebody to read in Genesis 17, 1 through 6.
This is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I have made you the father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you.
Okay, so God says something really interesting that I don't want to miss in the first verse of that. He says, you will walk before me. Aren't we supposed to follow God? Isn't it kind of dangerous to walk in front of God? I mean, shouldn't we be followers? So maybe there's something interesting being communicated here about being in front of. So I want you to think in the old days when the king was coming. Was there anybody in front of the king? A herald. And they were saying, hey, make way for the king. This is what he wants. This is what he's bringing. This is what he's about. And so we're already starting to understand, be introduced to the idea of what the mission of God's nation is going to be. It's going to be back to this idea of being made in the image and in the likeness of God. So we're going to see that Abraham represents God, and he acts in the role in a way that tells everybody who God is. So where is Abraham's land going to be? Canaan. Is Canaan located someplace interesting in that world? Is it out stuck away in a corner? Is it off the beaten path where nobody's going to see God's nation? It is in the dead center. It is on I-35 at the junction of 44, and there's probably construction in Canaan all the time. So you have Rome to the north, you have Egypt to the south. It's going to be the hub where everything goes through. So God picks a place where everybody is going to have to come by and see his nation and see his likeness and his image. Does that make sense? God tells Abraham something interesting. He says, you must be blameless. Is Abraham blameless? Let me ask a slightly different question. Is Abraham perfect? I had a friend tell me that there's a difference between those two ideas. Larry, do you want to take a quick stab at blameless versus perfect?
Well, I believe the phrase I used was sinless and blameless. So, using it in my own office around here, elders are supposed to be blameless, but it doesn't mean that we're sinless.
It's a hard thing to do, and we know from Abraham's story that he is not perfect. He is not sinless. And that he occasionally makes mistakes. And those mistakes have some long-running consequences, right? That still applies to us today. But God's promise to him is that he's not only going to make Abraham a great nation, he's going to make Abraham into a multitude of nations. We don't normally think about that. But a lot of the nations are going to hark back to Abraham as kind of their beginning. Now, I say all of this to get us up to speed and get us going, because they're going to Canaan, and they're going to go there as a nation. And now if I can get somebody also read in Exodus 19, 3 through 6.
Called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites."
Thank you. So this is the beginning of the covenant. This is the core of the covenant that God is making with the nation Israel as they have been taken out of Egypt and they're now at Mount Sinai. And they're getting ready to receive the law. This is going to be the written down version of what their obligations are and what God is asking of them. The law shows Israel how to live so God can truly bless them, and so they can be a blessing to the other nations around them. This covenant will show them how to be truly human. This covenant will show them how to live the way that God intended for them to live. A righteous relationship with God and others in this covenant relationship. That's what this law is going to try to do for this nation, is set these people apart so that the rest of the world, as they transfer through here, will finally get to see how God intends for man to live. They have some success, they have some failure. Oddly enough, we think of, at least if I want to go back to my flannel graph days, we always talked about the law that was given on the mountain was what? The 10 Commandments. Did you know that in the text of the Old Testament you will not find the reference, the 10 Commandments, anywhere in the text? You will see talking about the law being delivered on the mountain, and you will talk about tablets, but the only time you see the term the 10 Commandments is in the headings that were put in later. So there was actually, the law that was given on the mountain was given to Abraham in two distinct parts. Moses, thank you. We've moved on. I'm not moving on yet. But Moses, thank you. Moses receives the 10 Commandments, as we call them, on the mountain, but he also receives more than that. What are some of the other things that he receives? What's the other part of the law? It's called the judgments. So we know that we know this because, let me see here. I think it's in Exodus 24:3. Let me read it real quick. Yeah. So I'm going to do what Darrel did in his sermon. I'm going to jump to the end, show you how it ends, and then we're going to go back and talk about it a little bit. So Moses comes down, he delivers the law, and it says, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And the people answered with one voice and said that what the Lord has spoken, we will do. So the words are what the Jews call the 10 Commandments. And the words are an interesting thing because they are singular commands, they are absolute, they are typically written in second person singular. There is no punishment. Thou shalt not steal, or what? Doesn't say. Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain under these circumstances. No. Don't. Not today, not tomorrow, not next week. Those are how the commands, how the words, and they call them again the 10 words, are written. But what comes after the 10 words, we kind of think of as case law. So what we get what comes next in the judgments is you get stories like, if a man's ox gores another man, so now we're taking the words, the big ideas that we get in the 10 Commandments, and now those are being fleshed out in situations. And not only are they being fleshed out in situations, but there's also punishments or ramifications or fines or whatever you want to call it. All of the punishments that go along with not obeying the law are introduced. So when we think about Israel receiving these commands, we need to keep in mind a couple of things. That on Mount Sinai, it's not just the 10 Commandments. It's the 10 words, the big 10 precepts, if you will. And then you're going to get this long, complicated section of the law, which is, if you want to go back and read the differences, I can tell you where they are. So the 10 words happens in Exodus 20, and the judgments come Exodus 21 through 23. So we have about 3 chapters listing out kind of the bulk of the law. And that's what the Jews agree to when it's over. They will follow this. They're not just following the 10 Commandments, they're following all of that. I also want to point something out again about Jewish culture and how they write and structure things that's important for us to keep in mind. So when Paul says we follow the law, he doesn't just mean the law. He means the law and the prophets. And when he means the law and the prophets, he doesn't just mean the law and the prophets. He means the 10 words, the judgments, and the prophets. But he calls it the law. He gives you that synopsis at the beginning, knowing that everybody means all the things after it. We see this a lot of places in the text. We know that when Jesus was on the cross, he cries out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's not all he's saying about that moment. He's saying the whole psalm. If you go back and read the whole psalm, you will see what Jesus was trying to communicate in that moment. It's all of it. You'll see this a lot, that the way that the Jews learned the stories and learned these big blocks, when they wanted to communicate about them, they would start with the opening line or the opening idea, and then everybody went, "Oh, you mean the whole thing." So when we're talking about the law, when we talk about the commands, we're really saying those 2 big blocks together. Darrel?
All right, so here's where it gets interesting, because the covenants that we've been looking at so far, God basically says, I will do these things for you. And there are some general guidelines he gives. You need to be faithful and these kind of things. But now, as we get to the 10 words, he now says, this is the stuff that you're going to do. All right? We tend to be, as New Testament Christians, sometimes we have a problem with the law. The law is kind of seen in a negative light, because it's like, oh, the law is bad, it's evil. What does Paul say about the law? He says the law is actually quite good. If we didn't have the law, we wouldn't know what the standards were. But what is the problem with the law? The law will point out sin, right? Or tell you how to stay away from it, but it cannot do what? It can't take it away. So it's kind of like we need the law to point out what we are doing wrong, but what do we do when we do something wrong, right? So that'll be the problem that Jesus is going to fix later. We're going to have like days of atonement where God's going to do some things in the Old Testament to kind of appease his wrath and things like that. But so we get to Exodus chapter 20. We have these words. Let me just ask you, if we were going to start a new nation in this room, we're going to go to some land that's not occupied, or we're going to conquer it or whatever, and we get to set up our own nation. What kind of laws do you think we would need to put into place so that there's not utter chaos? What would be the laws that you would think would be important? Or should we just let everybody do what they think is right in their own eyes? That didn't work out very well in Judges. Okay, laws about property. That's good. What else? How we should treat each other. And those things actually kind of go together. Learning how to treat each other will actually help you learn how to treat somebody else's property. What else? I don't want to live with you all if we don't have any rules, I'll tell you that. We got to more structured than that. What to do when someone gets out of line, right? So there's got to be punishment. And the punishment needs to fit the crime, right, as we always say. All right, so we have the 10 Commandments. The first one is what? The 10 words. You shall have no other gods before me. Second is, they're in Exodus 20 if you need help. No idols or no graven images. Okay, and number 3, remember the Sabbath day. No, don't misuse the Lord's name. And then number 4, Sabbath day, right? Did you realize that 7 of these laws that are in here, or 6, are actually in other cultures at this time? The Hittites have rules like this. The Jebusites and all the other termites and everybody else, they all have similar rules when it comes to how to treat each other. You can't have a society, you can't have a nation without some kind of moralistic code. So what separates this moral code from the code of all other nations? There you go. Yeah, so if you look at how this is set up, starts out with how we are to have relationship with God. And then the rest of them, starting with honor your father and mother, are about how we are to treat each other. And I think it's interesting that he starts with, when treating each other, he starts with the family. If you can't treat your own mom and dad right, how would you know how to treat anybody else? So you have these codes. We're going to talk about, just as John said, how do we love God? And how do we love others? But here's the interesting thing. These are the 10 words. They're supposed to be really important. By the time we get to Jesus, the Jews have 613 commands. 613. Some are scriptural, some are not. So the teacher of the law in Matthew 22 goes to Jesus and says, you got to tell me which of these commandments are important because I fail all the time. At least that's the way I kind of paraphrase it. Now, here's the weird thing. We have these 10 words which God writes on stone. Which of these 2 does Jesus talk about? What does Jesus say? The greatest commands are, number 1, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second is, love your neighbor. That's not even in here. That's in Leviticus. Leviticus 19, it says it twice. You're to love your neighbor. Now, number 1, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. You could probably get that out of number 1 here. So my question for you is, if these 10 words are so important and God founds a nation on these principles, why would Jesus go a completely different direction, or does he? Why didn't he go back to the 10 Commandments and go, just follow the top 10 and you're good? Where's Jesus going with love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and love your neighbor as you love yourself? That's right. So even the 10 that we have right here, they all boil down to relationship with God and each other. But by the time we get to the New Testament, the Jews don't see that. Have you ever gotten so caught up in the rule you forget what it was actually for? That's the whole Sabbath argument Jesus makes, right? Oh, we can't heal on the Sabbath day. He's like, really? You'd take your donkey, if it fell into a pit, you'd take him out. And so this is all about relationship, but God is going to call them to account. Now, what else I want to ask is, why do you think he phrases it the way that he does? These are second person singular. It's been a while since I've been in grammar school. But it's saying you shall do. Why are they prohibitive? Why is it written in a language of prohibition? You shouldn't do this. Why didn't he say, hey, everybody has the right to life? That'd be the same thing as don't murder. Why do you think he structures this the way he does? Don't do this. That sounds kind of negative. And he says, you. Why does he write the way he does? Yeah, why?
Because we're immediate in our thinking as far as, and concrete thinking that we can read that, but then how to interpret it is the issue. So if you're given that example, if you're not supposed to do this, you know that that's there.
Yeah, I like the way
It is.
Karen opened up. She says, we need to be told this.
That's a command.
That's right.
It's not declarative, it's imperative.
That's right. And, don't want to open up a can of worms here, but how worried are we today about rights?
Or more than we are about responsibility.
More than responsibility a lot of times, right? It's my right. So the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called the what? The Bill of Rights. And how many arguments do we have? And these are important. I'm not downplaying them. But how many arguments do we have in government over what we have the right to do? I don't think that this is about your rights in the 10 words. I think it's written this way so that the emphasis is not putting back on you. Oh, I have the right to life. I have this right. No, it's turning it and saying, you need to do this for other people. Think of them first before you think about yourself. Think about God first and others second before you think about yourself. What a great place this world would be if we put God first, others second, and ourselves third.
Darrel,
Yeah.
he talks about it in the book. This is fleshing out what it means to live in the likeness of God.
That's right.
So you're an image bearer, but how do you live in the likeness of God? You don't do these things because God doesn't do these things.
Yeah, so we have the first commandment. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Someone break that down for me. What is he saying there?
Nothing should be more important than him.
Nothing should be more important than God. And that's the way I've always interpreted it, and I think that's a decent interpretation. Now, the author of the book is going to make an argument that it's not always, you should have no other gods before me. He's not talking priorities here. He's talking spatially. Right. In other words, it's not just enough to say, God, you're before all these gods. Because what that actually is henotheism. And he makes an argument that the Jews, at least at the beginning, were not monotheistic. Monotheistic meaning what? There's only one God. He makes the argument the Jews, at least at the beginning, believed in henotheism, which is there is one God above other gods. Do you see how that's different? There's the acknowledgement of other gods, but God gets the highest spot. And so when we look at you shall have no other gods before me as a priority thing, you could still say that there are other gods in here, just put God on top. So what the author of the book would say, and you don't have to agree with him or not, but he's talking about spatially. There's no other gods that are to be in his presence. Anybody take Greek mythology in here in high school? How did the Greek gods make decisions? What's that? You slept since then. You ever see the Greek gods would meet on Mount Olympus, and they'd get together and they'd have these little conversations, and then they would decide what they're going to do. And usually Zeus got his way because he was supposed to be the god that was above the other gods. This is the way that ancient culture has looked at theism for a long period of time. Let me read you what he says in the book. He says, in the ancient Near East, The gods operated within pantheons, and decisions were made in the divine assembly. Furthermore, the principal deities typically had consorts. For the gods' life was a community experience. The destinies of gods were decreed in assembly, as were the destinies of kings, cities, temples, and people. The business of the gods was carried out in the presence of other gods. So it'd be very easy for them to think, oh, no other gods before God. So when they get together in their councils and their assembly, God gets the final say. Well, what's the problem with that? There's still other gods, and there's still, he says, accordingly, by comparative interpretation of the first commandment, the Israelites were not to construe Yahweh as operating within a community of gods, nor were they to imagine him functioning as the head of a pantheon surrounded by a divine assembly or having a consort. In short, God works alone. That's powerful. So when God says, don't have any other gods before me, he's not just saying, prioritize. He's saying, there is no other gods around me. There is only one. Do we have a habit of sometimes taking things or people and making them into idols? And we have sermons and we have classes and we say, we really need to work on our priorities. So what do? We don't get rid of the idols. We just try to make God bigger than the other ones. What would happen if we said, in order to prioritize our life, we have to realize there's only one. There's only one God, and everything else is not worthy of worship. And you can make almost anything into something to worship. If we're not careful, our kids can become what we worship. Our kids become the center of the universe. And why are they that way today? We made them like that. So next time you're like, oh, Generation Z, it's our fault. It's our fault. You can go to work because you want to supply for your family and you can have great intentions. We have to work, right? We can't just sit back and go, you know what? The Lord will provide. The Lord provides through your working hands. So I'm not saying that we don't have other things in our lives. I'm saying it can be really easy to say, and maybe we don't even think it, I have a lot of gods. I'm just trying to put Yahweh number one. If you have any other gods in your life besides Yahweh, it will not work. God works alone. Any questions or comments? You want to throw anything? Okay. So the second one, he says, you shall have no other gods before me. And then he says, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord, am your God. And I am a jealous God, punishing the children for their sin of the parents to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. That's very disturbing, but we'll have to do that another day. But showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. What does it mean when he says, you shall not make for yourself any image? Anybody have another version? Don't make for yourself any image. No graven images. That was the old King James, right? What is this whole word or command about? Is it just don't make idols? What's the point? Okay? By the way, I didn't get into this. It's one of your small group questions for this week if you guys are meeting. The snake that Moses makes at the command of God in Numbers chapter 21. If you go to 2 Kings, Hezekiah is commanded by God to destroy it. Why? They began to worship it. They began to think that that symbol, that banner, which God was behind, was actually a God itself. So I really think that's what this is kind of boiling down to. But you go ahead.
I want to take you right back to the garden again. We're made in the image of God, and we're made in the likeness of God. So if we're made in the image of God, and that's where we draw our power from, that's where we draw our identity from, that tells us who we are, then what's the problem with having another image? It means that our identity is coming from someplace other than God. It means that our power is being drawn from something other than God. You can keep going back to that. I love going back to that creation story is telling us who we are, where we're from, where we're going. And all of these stories after it keep trying to get us back on that track. That's why we're making the case that the covenant that God makes at creation is just refreshed and retooled as the nation grows. It's not a new covenant every time. It traces all the way back to God's original plan. And anytime we stick something in front of that plan or derail that plan, we're asking for a disaster.
Yeah, and I love what John said a few weeks ago. Why weren't there any images? Why weren't they to create any images in the temple and otherwise? Who is the image of God? We are. We are the images. So think about that. But how do we usually treat this today? Don't make any graven images. I know there are a lot of people that you grew up going to a church building that there was not to be a cross anywhere in the building. Because even the cross could become a graven image. We inherited this building from the Oakdale Baptist. They moved down the street. They had a bunch of crosses on the wall. We took most of them down, left one of them up. We've gotten complaints. Or when you see a picture of Jesus or of this or that, what usually happens, especially with the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism and some of the things, there'll be statues. I don't think God is saying don't do art that represents Scripture. He's saying don't use art in such a way in which you are worshiping it or trying to worship me through it. That's the big thing, right? Because in Roman Catholicism, there are statues of Mary, and they believe that she has certain powers through that statue. How many times do you read about someone saw the face of Mary in the snow, and so they put up a cathedral there? Okay? So when he says, don't have any graven images, I don't think he's saying, hey, don't ever draw a picture of Jesus. I think he's saying, don't ever think that you're going to worship through that. But one of the things is when we create pictures is we tend to create what we think God is or looks like in our image. So if you were to go to Africa, to any country in Africa, and you walked into their church, if they had a picture of Jesus up on the wall, what would he look like? He's going to have dark skin, right? You go to Japan and you walk into some place, they have a picture of Jesus, he's going to look Japanese. It's not wrong to think about God in our way, but we need to realize that's not the only way that God thinks, okay? And it can become kind of dangerous.
But we're also not saying that you shouldn't be trying to worship God through images. Because the way that we worship God is by loving our neighbors, which is the image of God. So if you want to worship, it's not a worship of an image, but in loving your neighbor and loving the people in this congregation and loving your friends and your family, you are obeying God's idea, which is you are taking care of his likeness. So it's the context of this that is so rich.
Right. Well, you're bearing the image. So you're reflecting the image of God as you're worshiping with your neighbor or fellowshipping with your neighbor, but you're not worshiping your neighbor, right? So, yes, we are image bearers, but it'd be really weird to say, Hank, my next door neighbor, stand there, I'm going to worship through you to get to God, all right? But that's what they would do in a lot of these ancient Near East religions. They would create these sculptures or statues or whatever, and they would think that they had power and they'd worship through them. And God says, you don't need. So this is my big argument against needing a priest to go go to and confess your sins to. I don't worship through that priest. I have a high priest that says, come to me alone. Okay? So, no graven images. Am I still on? Can you hear that? Okay. The third one, don't misuse the name of the Lord your God. Or, the old school would say, don't do what? The Lord's name in vain. Now, we talked about this a little bit with the names of God. What does it mean? What does the name vanity mean, or vain? It means empty or hollow. Don't use God's name in a way that is meaningless. Don't let God's name fly off your tongue and there's not thought or premeditation behind it, because the name of God is so holy. Jesus says to hallow the name of God. Set it apart. Use it in responsible ways. That's why to this day, when Jews are at the synagogue worshiping, when they come across the YHWH, the name for Yahweh or Jehovah, they still will not say his name, but they will say Adonai instead. Okay? But it also could have the meaning of this. It's not just don't use it flippantly, but I think he's also saying don't use my name in a way for your advantage. Don't take my name in vain. There's a few verses I want to look at here. Let's go to Psalm 139. I'm going to start verse 19. If only you, God, would slay the wicked away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Now, what do you think the psalmist David is saying when he says, they misuse your name? You think they're cussing as they're killing people? What do you think it means? Well, what's that? Yeah. I was going to say, you could give another example. Have you ever seen anybody misuse the name of God? Not just in a way that they're what we would call cussing, but you're like, ooh, I don't know. They use the name of God for personal gain. We would call that blasphemy, right? Karen?
With some of the religious folks you hear on TV and different things where they use the name of God like it's a magic potion. You know, in the name of God, I declare that you
Yep.
no longer be sick or whatever. And I don't think that's the way to use his name. It's not like a magic wand.
Yes, and there were people that try to do that, right? We see that in Scripture. Saul really wants to use the name of God, and so he's going to try to force the offering before they go out in battle, and that takes the kingship away from him. And there are people who will say, in the name of Jesus, and they do exactly what they want to do. I think we have to be very careful how we carry the name of God with us. And so, yes, don't use it emptily. Don't use it emptily. Emptily? Okay. But also don't use it as a way for your advantage. So think about how the name of God is used. There's a point, I can't remember what the scripture was, but Aaron was to take the names of the 12 tribes, and they were to be etched on onyx stones, and they were to be put on the ephod that he would wear as he went into the Holy of Holies, or he would go in to minister. And those names of the tribes were to be carried into the presence of God, and those names represented something. So we, as the image bearers of God, we wear the name of Christ. And so when we go out into public, when we leave this place, we are taking the name of God with us. And we are these image bearers, so we have to be very careful about how that name is expressed and displayed in public. You hear all the time, I have no problem with Jesus, I just don't like Christians. I don't like church, but I love the Lord. What are people saying? I don't like the way that people carry the name of Jesus. Now, I would argue you can't love the Lord without loving the church. But I will credit them and say sometimes the church is very hard to love. To live above with the saints we love will be my theme and glory. To live below with the saints we know, well, that's another story. Right? Yeah, you got to be careful how you use it. And I think when I'm saying have it Yahweh, it's let it be Yahweh's way, but we don't need to profit off of it. And so I'll take down my T-shirt idea. Won't be making any. But you're right. Yeah, I mean, the reverence in the way that it was used in Judaism, I think that's probably correct. To revere the name of the Lord. Now, I also don't think we need to build rules around rules, but just be respectful in the way that we use the Lord's name. And again, what are these three words, the first commandment's all about? Don't do this. It's not what it's about. It's, I'm trying to set up relationship with my people. And if I'm going to have a relationship with you, I can be the only God. I have to be the only God. And you have to treat me in a way with respect. And don't go be worshiping through anything or anybody else. Okay? So next week, we are not going to have class because it is going to be spring break. We'll just have worship. In 2 weeks, we'll get to part 2 of the Sinai Covenant. John's not going to be here, so you'll be stuck with me. But we'll get through it. We'll make it down the mountain. And then we'll head on to David in 3 weeks. Okay? Thanks for being here all. Have a great week.